All right, so today we're going to be doing a deep dive into this concept of obedience in the Christian faith. And you've sent over some really fascinating excerpts from, looks like a video series.
It is a video series, yes.
Okay, yeah. So Temple's Table, Obedience Ep17. And I'm ready to unpack this with you.
Awesome, me too.
So, one of the things that jumped out to me right away was just that question, is obedience truly better than sacrifice? I mean, that's a pretty big statement, right?
Yeah.
How does our obedience reflect our love for God? And what does it actually look like to walk in obedience in our everyday lives?
All great questions. And these excerpts, I think, touch on some really foundational principles in Christian theology, exploring that relationship between faith and action and love. And so it's going to be interesting to see how those things all kind of come together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I love how these excerpts kind of jump right in right away with that really powerful statement from 1 Samuel 15.22. To obey is better than sacrifice. I mean, that's pretty bold, don't you think?
It is bold. And, especially I think when you consider the historical context of sacrifice in the Old Testament,
Right.
so much emphasis was placed on, the sacrificial system. And
Exactly.
yeah, so to have this statement come in really kind of throws a curveball at that way of thinking.
Yeah. Can we unpack that a little bit? Like, what was the significance of sacrifices back then? And why would this verse have been such a radical shift for the Israelites?
Yeah, so, in the Old Testament, sacrifices were a major part of worship, and they were seen as a way to atone for sin, to make things right with God.
Right.
But then along comes this verse, and it's like God saying, hey, wait a minute. I'm looking for something deeper than just, these outward rituals. I want your heart. I want your obedience.
So it's not about just going through the motions.
Right. Yeah.
It's about a genuine change of heart, a change of will, aligning our will with God's faith. That's a pretty relevant message for us today, too, I think. We can get so caught up in the outward appearance of faith.
Oh, for sure.
But this verse is a good reminder that it's really about an inner commitment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this idea of inner transformation is echoed. When you look at Deuteronomy and you see this stark contrast between the blessings that come with obedience and then the consequences of disobedience.
You're talking about Deuteronomy 11.2628.
Yeah.
Where it presents that choice blessings if you obey, curses if you don't. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it lays it out there. And it's a reminder that our relationship with God is a covenant. It's a two-way street. He promises to bless us when we walk in obedience.
Right.
But there are consequences when we choose to go our own way.
And, I love that imagery from Isaiah 48.1. Your peace would have been like a river, your well-being like the waves of the sea. It's such a beautiful picture of what it looks like to live in obedience.
Yeah, it's a beautiful picture of that inner state of someone who's living in obedience and, like a river that's just flowing freely unobstructed. That's what our lives can be like when we are in harmony with God's will. We experience true peace and, just this abundance.
So we're seeing that obedience is about more than just rule following. It's about a deep heart connection with God.
Yeah.
But how does love fit into all of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's where the Gospel of John comes in. In John 14.15, Jesus makes this incredibly profound statement. He says, if you love me, keep my commandments. So he connects those two things directly, love and obedience.
He's saying it's not a burden, it's an overflow of our love for him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not about trying to earn God's love, but about responding to the love that he has already shown us.
It really makes me think, how do I experience that connection between my love for God and my willingness to obey his commands?
Yeah.
That's something I need to think about a little more.
Yeah, definitely something to reflect on. And, speaking of that connection between love and obedience, the person who embodies this most perfectly, of course, is Jesus himself. And, in the temple summary that you sent over, there's this reference to Philippians 2.8, which talks about Jesus' obedience to the point of death.
Wow. Yeah, that's a verse that always kind of stops me in my tracks. His sacrifice on the cross is the ultimate example of obedience driven by his love for us.
Yes, and theologically, it's incredibly significant. Christ's sacrifice, it atones for our sin, but it also serves as this perfect model for us to follow.
It's a high calling, but it's also incredibly inspiring. How can we as imperfect humans, draw on Jesus' example to empower our own walk of obedience?
Yeah.
Especially when it gets tough.
That's such a good question, and it's something that I think a lot of Christians wrestle with. And these excerpts, I think, offer some practical guidance.
Yeah.
One thing that stood out to me was from Isaiah 48.18, where it talks about paying attention to his commands.
Right, like really tuning in and listening.
Yes, tuning in and listening.
And Jeremiah 7.23 talks about walking in obedience. So this isn't a one-time decision. It's a daily commitment to following God's leading.
Yeah, it's a journey. It's a journey of continually seeking to align our lives with His will.
But it's not always easy, is it?
It's not always easy. Sometimes, following God might clash with what other people expect of us.
Right, absolutely. Like in Acts 5.29, when Peter and the apostles had to choose between obeying God or human authority.
Yeah.
That's a powerful reminder that our ultimate allegiance is to God.
It is. It's a sobering reminder that, true obedience may require us to go against the grain, even if it means facing opposition.
Yeah.
Sometimes doing what's right may not be the popular choice.
That's a challenging thought. So, we've talked about the importance of paying attention, walking in obedience, prioritizing God's will above all else. But practically speaking, how do we translate these principles into our everyday lives?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting, and that's what we're going to explore in part 2 of this deep dive.
Okay, I'm ready. Let's do it.
One thing that really struck me as we were looking at some of those Old Testament passages is how the New Testament picks up on this theme of love being the foundation of obedience.
Yeah, that's right. We talked about John 14.15 earlier, where Jesus says, if you love me, keep my commandments. But there are other passages in these excerpts that really drive this point home.
Oh, absolutely. Like in 1 John 2.3-6, where it talks about how keeping God's commands shows that we truly know Him and that our love for Him becomes complete through obedience.
It's beautiful, isn't it? It's not about following rules out of duty or fear. It's about allowing our love for God to flow into action. Obedience becomes an expression of that love.
Exactly. And there's a line in the temple summary that I think captures this perfectly. It says that obedience is the only true aligning factor that connects us to God and proves our love for Him.
I love that phrase, aligning factor. It's like our hearts and minds come into harmony with God's when we choose to obey.
And that alignment leads to something even more profound. In John 14.23, Jesus says that if we love Him and keep His word, the Father will love us and make His home with us.
So obedience opens the door for a deeper, more intimate relationship with God.
It does. It's not about earning God's love, but about positioning ourselves to fully receive it.
Which brings us to a really thought-provoking question that's raised in these excerpts. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you? That's from Luke 6.46, right?
Yes, and it's a bit of a gut check, isn't it? It makes us examine the authenticity of our faith. Are we just giving lip service to Jesus, or are our lives truly reflecting His teachings?
It's a question we all need to ask ourselves. It's easy to say the words, but true faith is shown through our actions, through our obedience.
And I think the excerpts give us some really helpful guidance on how to move from those empty words to genuine obedience. One thing that stands out is the emphasis on actually living out God's law.
You're referring to Matthew 5.17, where Jesus says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them.
Exactly. And then you have Galatians 6.2, which talks about fulfilling the law of Christ by carrying each other's burdens.
So it's not just about following a bunch of rules. It's about living out the heart of the law. Love, compassion, serving others.
Yes. And all of those things are beautifully summed up in that passage about the greatest commandment, Matthew 22.36-40.
You mean where Jesus says that the most important command is to love God with everything we've got, and the second is to love our neighbor as ourselves?
Yeah, that's the one. And
Yeah.
then he says that all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments.
It's like the whole of Scripture boils down to those two things, love God, love others. And everything else, including obedience, flows from that.
Right. When we truly love God, we naturally want to please Him and follow His will. And when we truly love others, our actions will reflect that.
So obedience isn't a chore or a burden. It's the natural fruit of love.
It is. And in the excerpts, there's this powerful image of what a life of obedience looks like. We become the salt and light of the world.
You're talking about Matthew 5.13-16, right? Where it says that salt preserves and adds flavor and light shines in the darkness.
Exactly. When we live in obedience to God, we become agents of His grace and truth in the world. We're called to make a difference to point people to Him.
So it's not just about our own personal relationship with God. It's about how our obedience impacts the world around us.
That's right. Our obedience has a ripple effect, drawing others to the light of Christ.
Wow, what a powerful thought. Our choices, our actions really do matter. They have the potential to make a real difference in the world.
They do. And I think this brings us back to the core message of these excerpts. Obedience is not just about rules, it's about love. It's about aligning our hearts with God's expressing our love for Him through what we do and becoming beacons of His grace and truth in the world.
That's a beautiful and inspiring message. But how do we take all of this and apply it to our lives?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because that's exactly what we're going to unpack in the final part of this deep dive.
All right, so we've talked a lot about the what and the why of obedience. We've seen how it's connected to love and how it can deepen our relationship with God. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what about the practical side of things?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? How do we actually live this out?
Yeah.
And I think these excerpts give us some good clues. One that stood out to me was the importance of being attentive to God's voice.
Yeah, like we were talking about earlier, that idea from Isaiah 48.18 about, paying attention to his commands.
Exactly. It's about being present, mindful of God's presence in our lives
Mm-hmm.
and seeking his direction in everything we do, big decisions, little decisions.
So it's not about waiting for, a booming voice from heaven or something.
Yeah.
It's about learning to recognize God's voice in the everyday moments.
Yes, and it might involve setting aside time for prayer, reading scripture,
Yeah.
but it also means learning to be still quieting our minds and our hearts and listening for that gentle nudge, that inner prompting that guides us.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to remember that obedience isn't always easy. Sometimes it requires courage, sacrifice, a willingness to go against the grain.
Oh, absolutely. We see that in the example of Peter and the apostles in Acts 5.29. They chose to obey God even when it meant defying the authorities and facing persecution.
Yeah, that takes guts.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that, our loyalty to God needs to come before anything else, even when it's hard.
Even when it's hard. And that's where I think the image of walking in obedience from Jeremiah 7.23 is so helpful. It reminds us that this isn't a one-time decision.
Right.
It's a journey.
It's process, yeah.
It's an ongoing commitment to following God's lead, even when we're not sure where he's taking us.
A journey that requires perseverance, trust,
Yeah.
and a willingness to, step out of our comfort zone sometimes.
Yeah, definitely.
But as we've seen, the rewards are amazing.
They are. The excerpts remind us that obedience brings blessings, peace, a deeper connection with God.
It allows us to become that salt and light in the world, sharing his love and grace with everyone we meet.
That's a beautiful picture of what it means to live a life of obedience.
It is. So as we wrap up, is there any final thought you want to leave our listeners with?
I think it all boils down to this: obedience is an act of love. When we see it through that lens, it's not a burden, it's a joy. It's a way to show our devotion to the God who loves us more than we can imagine. And it's a journey worth taking one step at a time.
That's beautiful. And listener, as you continue on your own journey of faith, remember that God's grace is always there for you every step of the way. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into obedience.